Hey, Leonie, thank you for coming in. You have such a wonderful sort of narrative. I don't know how much you can share about your family history, but it's just fascinating. And then, of course, your own personal narrative is just such an exciting story of impact and contribution and across so many different domains. And you're one, life is one of servant leadership. So you're definitely a epitome of all of that. So thank you for coming in and sharing your insights with my audience.
So thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here and to be connecting with you finally after so long. So yeah, let's dive right in, and whatever questions you have, I'll do my best to answer however I can. And yeah.
So, Leonie, what were the three inflection points in your life that made you who you are today? And it could have been when you were 3 or 5 years old. It could have been 10. It could have been first job. It could have been inside, outside the family. It could be family history. It could have been a mentor. It could be something happened in your education, et cetera, et cetera. So, what are those things that made this wonderful person today?
Well, thank you for the question. Gosh, that's a loaded question. I don't know if there are three things, but if I could answer them, I would say definitely my upbringing, first and foremost. I have a very unconventional background and upbringing, growing up between multiple continents. I'm Luxembourgish American and Sri Lankan. And then I would also say, just from those three very polarizing cultures, one focusing more on environmental conservation and our deep connection with indigenous knowledge systems and with nature, and then another really focusing on economic growth and policy and innovation and entrepreneurship, really influenced the way that I saw the world. I also have had six parents, and each one was in entrepreneurship and environmental conservation. Mother was a social worker. So all of these factors really contributed to the way I look at the world very early on. So as a small 3, 4, 5, 6 year old.
So, from an education standpoint, did you find your family or the environments you were in were very supportive or were your interests sort of like poetry and arts and culture with some science? I mean, what were the things that really excited you? Or it could have been some sports endeavors. I mean, what are the things that you were passionate about when you were young?
Yeah. So many things. I mean, art was definitely first and foremost. I always grew up for the first 20 plus years of my life thinking I was going to be a fashion designer. I love designing. I have a background in arts design, but also in conservation and in science. But creating and designing was something that has been a part of my life since forever. And I think that was a way for me to connect when I was maybe going through a lot of challenges and moving around the world, having such a big family, and sort of losing touch with community art and creating was a way for me to really reconnect with myself as well as being outside with nature. Yeah.
So you indicated you had this kind of interest on the creative side, but you said science as well. So did you what kinds of science were really of interest to you?
Yeah. Well, growing up in Luxembourg, my background was very science heavy. It's just part of the school system. You go into various tiers, and if you're in Kinetik, then it's just a little more science heavy. But when I moved to the US, I went to the University of Texas at Austin. I actually, one of my academic backgrounds is in human ecology. And that's sort of a generalist scientist who looks at how human behavior is impacted by both the natural or built environments. And even though that was one of my academic backgrounds that I graduated with, it wasn't necessarily the primary focus when I did graduate. As I mentioned, arts was very much big in my upbringing. I was also a singer. I used to act. I was in musical theater. I still do act when I have time as a voiceover actor. But yeah, I sort of lived at the intersection of design, conservation because of family, and then also in sciences. But that was
So
really,
let's
yeah.
so let's go over your story arc then. In your story arc, um, you have all of these different interests. You go to the University of Texas of Austin. Yeah, you have this creative energy. You have this sustainability impact, this sort of energy. You have this human ecology energy. And then what were your first jobs that you had upon graduation?
Yeah, neither design or ecology. I actually became the first employee of Formula One Austin, which was a $500 million project that we created and formed Circuit of the Americas. So I was one of the founding members there, and was really able to get a global perspective on how we create and shift, well, create new markets first and foremost, but also shift human and consumer behavior. And that really tied, interestingly, into my background as a human ecologist and getting sort of a first row seat to understanding how human behavior really can shift, or societal changes are developed on a global scale with F1 Austin. But that was one of the first jobs that I had while I was in college and just graduating from college at the University of Texas.
And then what followed from there?
Yeah. Right after the inaugural race, I had gained such an immense experience being as an operator. Even prior to that, I was working as an intern with various designers, also as an operator, even though I was skilled as an illustrator when I was still focused on fashion. But operationally and really thinking about, business development was a strong suit of mine. And so I started a consulting. It was more a hybrid of a venture studio called TBCY Consulting, right around 2012, and post the inaugural race. And I began working with startups or with blue chip companies that had this idea of creating new markets, but weren't entirely sure on how to scale and how to make this really addressable to global markets. And because I already had a sort of amassed that understanding of really being able to shift consumer behavior, that was an advantage that I had, not just by understanding theoretically, but I also had that hands-on experience. And that sort of jump-started my career. I mean, I would say F1 definitely jump-started my career as an operator, as an entrepreneur, and then getting into private equity and venture capital. So I was one of the founding members, or on the founding team of starting Whole Foods e-store, which then became was instrumental in the first grocery delivery app. And yeah, there a lot of, and then I moved into investing in private equity and venture, was also partner of the largest online accelerator with New Chip. So have been in the startup and innovation ecosystem as an innovator, entrepreneur, and also investor for a long time now.
So as an investor and as an entrepreneur and operator, did you have some great sort of exit experiences or things like that, or that you can maybe talk about a few of them?
Yeah. So definitely I learned what was scalable from across the different sectors that I worked with. I mean, they were all very different, right? I worked in food and beverage and real estate and finance and motorsports and the fashion industry. But there were definitely commonalities across each of these sectors when it came to how we were creating and scaling new ideas and new markets. And each of these companies that I worked with went on to exit. And I was able to draw from, including Whole Foods, ultimately, they were acquired by Amazon. And so that was, these were huge learning opportunities for me to identify, what the biggest institutions and decision makers are really looking for when it came to new markets, especially when the rest of society or even these sectors initially never really believed in these ideas. All of the companies I would say that I worked with initially society and institutions did not want to back these ideas because they did not believe that they could scale, including with F1. And so, yeah, it was just a matter of understanding, what are the societal demands and economics behind what shifts consumer behavior. And ultimately, those all led to exits. And I was able to then participate in looking at policy reform, and moved into a lot of different sectors, from like women in venture. So.
And then, so you have this kind of multi-sector, multi-domain, multi-dimensional background. And then how did that lead to the sort of the next phase of your professional life?
Yeah, great question. So as you can tell, I worked across so many different domains, but I would say the common thread there was definitely being an innovator in new markets and thinking, how can we develop strategies and really help these ideas scale, be commercially viable and scale globally. How it led me to Kinetik right now, because I'm obviously now back to conservation, a place I didn't really think that I was going to be in maybe 20 years ago. But it was really during this time of working with some of the top 1% of decision makers and capital allocators that I realized there were such huge gaps in how we actually look at sustainability and even systems thinking. And systems thinking was really just not even a concept that was brought to the table. Everyone, while we were making, money and getting to exits, was still very linear in thought in terms of how we could catalyze common missions and our efforts, whether it had anything to do with sustainability or not. And it's because of this global understanding and being able to identify those gaps that I realized that, one of the biggest disconnects, especially in Europe and the US, I would say, with sort of the dominant players when it comes to our economic development or consumer development, is that there's a big disconnect in how we perceive humans to be a part, or even culture on a global scale, to be a part of scientific innovation. And I can dive further into like an exact example that came up. But yeah, that was just recognizing those gaps and disconnects globally is what ultimately led me to try or to raise and start Kinetik.
Okay, so you indicated some gaps. Can you get into more specifics there?
Yeah. So some of the gaps were, while we were really building out these new markets, the advantage that I was able to bring to the table was understanding like human ecological or systems thinking practices. So how, for instance, does supply chain manufacturing impact a community, or how does a conservation capacity building program impact that's built in Nepal, or that we were working on in Nepal, impact a community in New York, for instance. And often when I was in communication with the different players, either with the capital allocators in New York, for instance, and with the conservationists in Nepal, I'm just making Nepal up as an example because I have actually done work there. There was just this lack of awareness of what each profile and each member was sort of bringing to the table. And that was when it really became clear that these decision makers, especially those in policy reform, whether they were delegates or heads of institutions, didn't really have a global understanding and awareness of how our environments and nature was actually impacting their sectors and their bottom line. So basically, how are we all interconnected with nature? and how is humanity interconnected with that, even when we don't think so. So that was sort of what came through.
Okay, so talk about your current endeavor and maybe give some idea of structure and what you hope to achieve, and what are some of the challenges, what are the opportunities. Just kind of give a pretty good overview so that people get an idea of what you're involved with right now.
Yeah. So, to answer your question from earlier and then leading into that, one of the biggest disconnects that I realized is that all of these concepts and ideas of really exiting and building unicorns and creating new markets were really ultimately not sustainable, because we were utilizing resources that had a limit, whether it's our natural resources that we severely depend on. However, we were sort of chasing this this concept of evolution that was deeply tied to GDP, or is deeply tied to GDP. So very linear thought. And when I realized that, just scientifically, how over the past 60 years, over 70% of all wildlife has declined. I believe there was a stat by the World Wildlife Fund that was released. That became quite evident that in order to continue to produce, we definitely needed to continue to protect and replenish and regenerate the resources that we still rely on. So I sort of spiraled and went down as a researcher, and sort of returned to my role as a human ecologist. I had been volunteering throughout the entirety of my career, even as a teenager and very early on, because my mother was a social worker. So it was very common for me to work as a human ecologist, but just not professionally as I am doing now prior to that. So I had already amassed a pretty significant understanding of the interdependencies between humans and our environments, and how that connects to our economy and globally. And part of that was being able to understand and see how half of global GDP is actually dependent on nature. And many of the when it came to policy and really thinking of how can we continue to move these economies forward, while also being in sort of considering these marginalized communities that had a very rich surface area of biodiversity, biocritical and endemic species, became sort of center of what I wanted Kinetik to focus on. So Kinetik is a consulting and venture development firm that I began about 5 years ago. And it began really as a way to show our marginalized communities that are biocritical hotspots, for instance, like Sri Lanka, Hawaii, Japan, the Amazon, whose voices are often left behind when it comes to innovation and science, especially from dominant players and industries. And what I began doing was really highlighting and educating them on how their natural resources, including culture, is actually an economic asset and could really advance the global economy if we were thinking of the global economy as the bioeconomy. So a nature-centric, nature-inspired, nature-driven economy. This definitely doesn't take away from existing economies such as the fashion industry or agriculture, but it was really trying to shift perspective and understand how these voices could actually be a catalyst to moving society and our evolution toward a more nature-centric world. And that is what Kinetik focuses on. Now it's been 5 years. We've worked with about a dozen countries in the field, but also have conducted literature reviews and scientific research that is quite original in how, dating back hundreds of years, of how these regions and their knowledge systems, whether it's through their indigenous communities, or just their local knowledge of ecology can actually create new markets that are scalable and continue economic growth for these legacy industries, but in more environmentally friendly ways, and that are sustainable by reducing biodiversity loss. So that, in a nutshell, is what Kinetik focuses on now. Yeah.
So you have this consultancy group which works with different countries around the world and communities. How do people engage with you then? Is it like a government agency gets in touch with you, or somebody does an introduction and says, hey, Leonie is kind of like a guru, a master, wise in this area, and you need to engage with her in their consultancy? How does that work?
Yeah. So absolutely, that's definitely one way. I think now that we've been doing this research for an extended period of time, I've been able to be in roles where I'm advising, for instance, SIDS, so small and developing states, and I get to access dozens of biocritical regions. So that is one way. So we definitely have close relationships and ties to governments, and then we can come in and conduct high feasibility studies to identify, what are there natural resources and ways to leverage their ecological knowledge of their community as well as their natural assets as economic assets. And ultimately, all of this, including the report, assists in mobilizing capital and shifting policy to protect these communities and these regions, and make sure that the voices of these communities are seen from a place of strength rather than being just vulnerable ecosystems, because that is the dominant narrative, which is that most islands and SIDS, and I focus on islands because of their uniqueness in biocritical factors, as well as bioculturally rich factors that we as human ecologists, or I as a human ecologist, study. But I think it's also important to share that the innovation side, as mentioned previously, I come from private equity and venture capital as well as innovation. So the intent of Kinetik, even though it was to bridge the gaps, it was also to really invest in early stage deep tech that focused more on nature-based, nature-inspired, nature-driven innovations to highlight not only the research that would come from these regions, but then ultimately also innovations that can be influential in how we create new markets globally. So we are a nonprofit. We're a fiscally sponsored nonprofit, actually. And we are able to work with various institutions through grants and conduct scientific research, but then also have our venture side, which allows us to make investments in innovations that we identified are good examples that either come from islands or don't. They don't necessarily have to come from these regions, where really the investment portfolio is really meant to highlight the value of nature as a teacher to reduce biodiversity loss in legacy industries.
So the investments, though, are more like grant kind of investments, or not equity investments, right? Or how does that work?
They are equity investments. Yeah, they would be, but we could receive, because of our DAF, which is a donor advised fund, grants in order to make investments.
So tell me more about donor advised fund. Like how does that set up? What does it mean? A lot of people probably have not heard of what a donor advised fund for investments is.
Yeah. So Legacy Global is our organization, fiscal sponsor. We've been in the space of learning about DAFs for a decade, and it still often is very challenging to grasp all the nuances of it. But basically, it's a way for nonprofits or NGOs to access capital that they can then invest for impact purposes. And I usually shy away from using words like impact and even sustainability and climate issues because they're so broad, right? But that is, as long as there's so we provide educational content, right, through our research, and that's how we're able to have a nonprofit, because a lot of this research is it's all free and it's educational. It's meant to be public, and it's meant to really advance and build bridge gaps in our knowledge systems between environment, innovation, and science and investing. So a lot of different sectors. It's very interdisciplinary in that sense. And but then because I have that background in private equity and venture, and I'm able to identify great companies that align with new markets. So my past experiences and thesis, I decided to have this venture arm as well. And so that structure, the DAF, Donor Advised Fund, is the best structure for that, but it's not the only way to do that.
So how's the regulatory handled on something like a DAF? How does that work?
I mean, so I probably can't. I'm not the best person to go into the details of this. I always send everyone to the team. So, but like regulatory in terms of like taxes, tax deductions and write-offs, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, and there's got to be some kind of regulatory oversight, right? Because you're using funds, and it's like venture capital. There are institutional investors, private equity. There's management of how these things work, right? The reporting structures and some governance that are government mandated, and so there must be some kind of overlay. But because you're international, how does that work? And you would then be centered somewhere, and like you'd have some locality that you're registered under, right? And then that would have though geopolitical considerations, right? And georegulation.
Those are all great questions that our fiscal sponsor handles. So it's pretty much turnkey for us, and they're the key player who will be part of any of those conversations. So we don't really have to dive into the weeds too much. They've been doing this for decades, so they're like one of the best players for that. Yeah.
Like, I see. So you got like a partner who handles all of that kind of front end sort of regulatory sort of aspects, which is great, right? So you don't have to worry about it. Do you then have this kind of...
Oh, sorry.
Do you have this idea of assets under management then idea, or does it work that way?
For the DAF, yeah, absolutely. It operates very similarly to, in venture. But with the DAF itself, it's all non-dilutive funding. So you're receiving grants or donations that could then be utilized for investments. And there is there could be the option, and I don't want to misspeak here, but to, receive or provide recoverable grants in that sense, depending on the returns of that particular investment. But it's mostly seen as like a donation that can be ultimately invested and then returned to be utilized for these educational purposes, or the same services that the nonprofit would then provide.
So you must be in sort of constant capital seeking mode too, and together with the projects you're running as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's quite standard, even in venture. Everyone's always raising capital. Yeah, I think this allows us to definitely broaden our profile and our network, because there is that educational component, and because we are building public and private sectors across like intergovernmental approaches.
Yeah, you described sort of a context of your work over the last few years and kind of this, research having centered on building a donor advised fund for investments. a nature-based solution. So I got a better understanding of the donor advised the DAP, which is interesting. And then there's this other aspect of developing an automation service that adapts to global threats and solutions as they evolve. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the end goal of this research. So what makes our research stand apart from others who might be in systems and earth system sciences, which there aren't that many, but we are not necessarily region specific. So we identify, we're guided by the natural and cultural aspects of specific regions that we've identified as scientists to be catalyst that reduces, ultimately, catalyst to the bioeconomy, whether that's reducing biodiversity loss, whether it's identifying new ecological knowledge that could help scale global new markets in various sectors, so global products. All of these are taken into consideration of how we identify the regions that we choose to work with. But first and foremost, it's really identifying that the loss of these regions, right? So through globalization, cultural assimilation, and colonization, we lose. One of the outcomes could be cultural erasure. And what happens when we lose culture, especially in these biocritical regions, is that we lose the threads that have allowed us to understand ecology and have this deeper relationship with nature. And part of the Kinetik's motto is, reuniting humanity with nature, 3.8 billion years of intelligence. But really, it's about expanding consciousness. And this has also been scientifically proven across different areas where nature is known to really have impacts on our well-being, on mindfulness, not just through meditation, but really through its frequency. And so that's, in a more abstract way and very macro level overview, one of the big pictures of Kinetik is to really expand human consciousness and show how, by investing in nature and in its cultural stewards, we will expand consciousness globally, but also that then impacts how we look at innovations and continue to move society forward, whether it's with a focus on GDP. Can we move away from that? What happens when we have a finite amount of resources and we've built this world that is completely dependent on GDP? We're like addicts, right? So how do you continue society in a way that is still healthy for the planet and for humanity? And part of that, and what we believe in, is by shifting perspective and building the bioeconomy, this nature-centric world that is really focused on regenerating and replenishing natural ecosystems. But in order to do that, we need culture. We need the stewards who understand the ecology and their regions very well.
But globally, there seems to be a movement that is not as sort of nature-based now than it was, let's say, 5-10 years ago. And so it's, there's this kind of movement maybe against sustainability and things like that. So that's become kind of more bifurcated, I guess. Whereas before maybe people were sort of overall in agreement. And now there's a trend towards, kind of two tracks out there, one that's not as oriented that way and the one that's more oriented that way. You were recently engaged in Japan. So what was that like in this new kind of changing dynamic that's in the world?
Yeah, I mean, Japan was wonderful. So I'm a guest researcher at the University of Tokyo, really to help expand upon the research of can various socio-ecological factors of a country or of a region be seen as an economic asset, including the knowledge of its cultural stewards, and if so, then how? So there quite a bit of dissecting knowledge in order to get there. And Japan has always been at the top of my list in terms of research, mainly because of its outward brand on how it's integrated into the environment, whether it's through biophilia, but then also has this very very connected sense of being to meditation, to wellness, to mindfulness, right? So outward looking, and even on the surface level, but prior to conducting, or after conducting literature research, it seemed to be a perfect place where we could perhaps learn from Japan with its thousands of islands that exist across the country, and how it is able to maintain a deeper relationship to nature, but also be, it's one of the G7, so it has like a very strong economy. And what are the lessons that other islands and other marginalized regions that have similar biodiverse species and topography to Japan? So that was the reason why Japan, and why, how my relationship with Japan came about. And then also to your point prior, when you mentioned, now there's sort of this disconnect between how we look at sustainability. I definitely would say that in the United States, with there's more of a lot of institutions are sort of moving away from specific terms around climate or sustainability. But I think that just goes back to, the inspiration behind all of this, and like with the seed that was planted initially. It's this disconnect and this strange human phenomena where we don't necessarily consider humans as part of biodiversity, and don't really think about why we need to be sustainable, why we need to think about the environment if we're thinking about the longevity of humanity. And so sustainability is not a choice. It's not necessarily something that we as as a society can afford to just say, oh, well, it's not top of mind. I think it's deeply embedded in our existence, whether institutions want to believe it or not. And, only time will tell for those who choose not to invest in it.
So you got a summit in September in New York. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So last year, or I would say this year, we are hosting the Future of Living Systems Summit, which was really sparked by the question of, we're all doing this great work, including our partners, and maybe the research is really original. But at the end of the day, we were still left with questions about, okay, what really is the future of our living systems? And what are the living systems? Is AI going to be considered a living system? Humanity, like culture, our natural ecosystems. And it was through that question that I decided, post our summit from last year, which was considered life-changing. We had, by some who attended, I didn't coin it that, but we had about 34 countries last year who attended our summit. It was called Islands Shaping the Future of Innovation and Science. And we were nominated by the UNGA Science Summit to host a session on the bioeconomy. And so it was such a success that we ended up receiving interest from some of our sponsors to continue and host another one this year. But this year, the title is Future of Living Systems. So we have many islands and island nations that will be represented and present, talking about how the intersections between nature and culture as economic assets, and how these biocritical regions, including their cultural stewards, are really what we need to fast track humanity towards a more sustainable, regenerative, and bioeconomic future. And so we'll talk about real economic case studies and solutions and innovations that are thriving or have been, worked on across a multitude of countries. I think this year we have we have less speakers, but we'll have about 13 different countries, but dozens that will be in the audience. So it's meant to attract, and it will attract investors, institutions, donors, policymakers, ministers of environment, so really the top decision makers across conservation who are really thinking about nature as an economic asset, but also highlighting how culture and the stewards of nature are what we need to fast track our understanding of nature and culture as an economic asset.
And then at the end of the summit, you'll have some kind of a report or something like that. How does that work?
Oh, sorry. I think the sound got disconnected. Yeah, so just like with the research in Japan, and how you asked, earlier, how do we do this research? We're mostly contracted by various governments to put together reports. And so Japan is one of those reports that we will be working on, as well as Curacao. We're also working on a report for them, and a few other island nations that are interested in identifying how their culture and cultural stewards can really be instrumental in global conversations around innovation and science. So that's going to happen. It won't be immediately after, but this is an ongoing report that will probably last for another year.
There's a lot of terms that you're using in, like cultural stewardship and biocritical and things like that. So sometimes when you have communities that are don't have a stability history, then those terms may not make a lot of sense. Is there other terms that you could use that is kind of embraces, all parts of the communities that are out there and ones that are not in that kind of sustainability environment? So they may not understand bio and critical and cultural stewardship and those kinds of words. And they may want some other kind of narrative that is simpler to their understanding. Do you have another kind of narrative at all? Or?
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic point, excuse me, because that is partly what comes through when we are doing this research across these different regions. And I'm speaking to you with these terms, but when I'm going to these communities, especially if I'm working with indigenous stewards or cultural stewards, farmers and fishers, I'm not using these terms. I simplify and say, how does your ecological understanding or awareness, impact X, Y, and Z? And I strip away these structures, but I mention these structures because our institutions and the dominant voices or players who determine what would qualify a country to, or a corporation to have a sustainable certificate, et cetera. These dominant players often are the ones using these terms: biodiverse, biocritical, bioculturally rich. And what we realize is, these terms do become limiting to those who come from regions who've had a deep relationship with nature and, sustainability, the concept of sustainability for hundreds of years. Japan was definitely one of those places, right? The Edo period shows that Japan prior to 100 years was very sustainable, resourceful, maybe regenerative in some ways. But when you use the word sustainability, regenerative with some of the community members, they don't understand their connection. And that's because we're using these very dominant this branding and this language that is not inclusive. We're using terms that do not resonate with the communities who have probably the best insights into how we can navigate our planet and land. So what we do in part of our research is by creating parallels between dominant terms and ways that each community can actually relate to those terms that is being authentic to their own culture and to their own language. So I guess your question was, do I have a different narrative? I mean, yeah, that's pretty much it. So it's how can nature and culture or ecological understanding be utilized as economic to move our economy forward without losing cultural authenticity?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I have friends across the entire spectrum, right? And as soon as you use words like ecological, bio-inspired, cultural, some of my friends will just not connect.
Yeah.
And you have to, it's like a friend of mine was saying, she's a big sort of proponent of impact. And she says, do you care about garbage? And clean up there. And he says, yeah, I get that. Yeah, absolutely. So she, and he's an investor and he's a prominent business person. And that kind of language was he just wasn't connecting.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you put it into terms that, okay, yeah, that makes sense, things like that. So because I have people who sit across the entire spectrum and they're investors and things like that, it'd be interesting. I'll do some thinking about how to convert that language into a language that they can resonate with and think, hey, I'm there's this kind of aspect of society where they think people are sort of oriented in that way and they don't want to connect with them. And really, there's a lot of common ground between the two. They just have to choose a narrative that everybody can agree to. Right? So
yeah, absolutely. And that's what's coming through in our research and in our engagements now that we have enough data that shows us patterns across different communities, across, globally. That language actually does vary country to country, culture to culture. And so it's important to why cultural authenticity and culture is a big part of our branding, even though culture in the broad sense is very vague, but we're looking at it from the sense of like ecological understanding. What are some philosophies and practices that have been part of your upbringing from when you were a child, and stories that have been shared and passed down of how to navigate certain ecologies, and and then we try to show the value in protecting that knowledge and also showing how they can also have a seat at the table when it comes to innovations, and how some of the biggest innovations, many that I've worked on that have developed new markets, created billion-dollar economies, actually come from ideas and knowledge that these communities have been very well aware of for hundreds of years, except they don't realize or recognize the value of that knowledge because it's positioned in a different language. So it's really about bridging those gaps and making sure that the language that we are globalizing is doing humanity, justice, rather than marginalizing those who can really help us move forward with better solutions that are nature-based, nature-integrated, or moving the bioeconomy forward. And we've identified what some of those solutions could be through our research.
So, Léonie, we're in our last kind of few minutes. If you could ask, maybe give questions to the audience that they should ponder or recommendations to the audience, what would you do and how would you do that? And what would they be? And then if you can summarize in a very kind of quick narrative of what you're working on, what the challenges are, how people can help you. So there's kind of like two parts of this question, what you're working on, and what are the gaps, how people can help you, how entities, enterprises, investors, institutions can help you to deliver and meet your goals and to exceed them and to realize your vision, right? And the outcomes of that vision. And I guess that's really part of your recommendations too, right? What are your recommendations to the audience because they can engage to support you in what you're trying to do, right? And maybe there's some questions you want to leave the audience as well, but in non-ecological terms, in terms that they'll say, yeah, okay, I can relate to that.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I know I mentioned there was a lot of different terms. So to simplify, I would say, where we are, what are the gaps and challenges, and how can community come together, different profiles or stakeholders come together to help? I would say, reuniting humanity with nature. That is first and foremost the biggest desire and need. The gap is reminding humans that we are part of nature. We are biodiversity, and we cannot exist. Neither can our sectors and industries exist without nature, period. Another understanding is, how do our ancestors and how do our cultures, how could they fast track our understanding or our ability to innovate in this new nature-centric economy? New nature-centric as an economy that Kinetik is really wanting to push forward, this green economy. So for investors, one of the challenges is this lack of this disconnect. Even institutions, despite the research and reports, still seem to have a disconnect and their awareness of how humanity deeply depends on nature. Not only humanity, but also how our global economy, over $7.7 trillion of it, depends on nature. So that's the first part, is we need more capital to be mobilized to these types of nature-centric innovations. And there is a significant upside to it. I mean, we're looking at 4 to 5x returns for many of the investments, and that only highlights one aspect of the bottom line. And then in terms of community, if there within the audience there are individuals who live in culturally rich, biodiverse rich, or nature rich regions, let's say that. If you're living in a jungle, if you're living in an island, if you're living somewhere where maybe you have a relationship or a connection to a natural habitat, whether it's through fishing, through farming, through art, your knowledge could potentially be something that fuels and creates a new market globally, because that is how, and so Kinetik is here to bridge that, to be that bridge between local knowledge and glocalize it. So it's called globalization, but that's a new term that I'm throwing out there, which I just recently learned as well. But yeah, so how can we take that local knowledge and then make it and highlight its value in the global economy? So that's what I would say are some of the challenges, and then where the areas that people could really think about.
And they can support you through your website, and there's a contact form and something like that. They could say, hey, I'm interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So if they're LPs, if they're investors, or donors, because of, who want to, support and move this research forward, there's very little of it out there. So that's why it's definitely needed. And if any of them want to support, including if there are founders and innovators who are thinking or being inspired by nature, whether it's through a new term, biomimicry, biophilia, these are modern terms, but really if they're learning from nature, from nature's natural ecosystems, then we want to hear from them. And the best way to reach us is through our website. That's www.kinetikvc.com, KINETIKVC.com. And yeah, and I'm accessible there. If they send in an email, it'll go to myself or our team. And yeah, we're a small team, so.
Is there any final question you want to leave the audience where they can ponder and so they can kind of meditate and think about, cogitate on?
I mean, I think what I mentioned earlier is, why do we feel that we are separate? If we feel that way, why do we feel that we are separate from biodiversity? I think that's the first step to allowing us to really reconnect and expand consciousness. Nature operates at one of the highest frequencies, and it helps us become attuned with other fields. And I'm not a physicist, so I'm not going to try and attempt to use any other jargon around that. But yeah, I think as someone who's also deeply spiritual, it is like the best way when we're trying to recenter ourselves and find alignment and peace. Nature is the best way to do that. And what could if we could imagine a world where everything that surrounds us is natural and biodegradable, in the sense where it's everything that we experience and touch is nature, in the sense where it is healthy for the environment. What could that world look like? And just encourage everyone to think critically and creatively, in that sense of what would nature do? What would nature's role be in a threat or a problem that we are trying to solve? What would nature do?
Okay, so thank you, Léonie, for coming in and sharing your deep insights and experiences with the audience. And you're on quite a transformative journey, and the planet can definitely use your capabilities, your wisdom, and all of the execution what you're doing worldwide for making a better world. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for providing your space as a platform to share all of the different things. And I hope it wasn't too complex and confusing. I always joke with my friends and even everyone, my background is one of those, you just kind of need one of those crime scene to follow. But when you do, then you get it.
Right. You're the hub of all this multidimensionality, right? So
yeah, I mean, just from my upbringing and family and going into professional career, it's been very global. So it's not always easy. Yeah, just narrowing that work down into something more linear. It's very systems.
Just in one closing thought, can you share any of your family narrative, or you perhaps don't wish to, because
Yeah. So my family in Sri Lanka has been deeply involved in public service for hundreds and even thousands of years. And they've been influential in really thinking, or basically in my role, thinking about how ecology and our environment are instrumental in systems thinking. And so yeah, they're deeply connected to the history of Sri Lanka, and its origins, and then also in origins of its island governance. So it's taught me a lot. That the narrative there has taught me a lot, and all the work that I do is definitely an homage to what they've accomplished and achieved, but also to the desires that we have not achieved yet. And Sri Lanka is such a beautiful and rich country. It's one of the most it has some of the most endemic species in the world as an island, and has a lot of upside to it. But as the narrative is quite common with other islands and countries that are deeply connected to nature and the environment, that they're seen as vulnerable and not really seen for the strengths that they have to contribute to the rest of the world when it comes to resourcefulness and efficiency and sustainable efforts. So Yeah.
So thank you again, and please take care.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.